10 years since Sri Lanka's civil war, ethnic and religious tension is running high again. Buddhist groups are accused of attacking Muslims while Tamils demand justice over alleged war crimes. Can Sri Lanka ever achieve lasting peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Sri Lanka is remembering a decade since the end of its civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed over 26 years as the government fought ethnic minority Tamils who wanted to create their own state. But just as stability was returning to the country, attacks on churches and hotels killed nearly 260 people on Easter Sunday last month. ISIL claimed responsibility, but the government blamed a little-known homegrown armed group. Mosques and Muslim-owned businesses were burnt down this week in revenge attacks. The government is blaming what it calls hardline Buddhist groups. It says the situation is now calm enough to lift a nationwide curfew. But the United Nations is warning that the violence could undermine peace efforts. Now, the civil war ended in 2009. Let's take a closer look at what's happened since then. In 2012, the government rejected a UN resolution urging it to investigate crimes committed during the last few years of the conflict. But in 2015, Maithripala Sirisena replaced Mahinda Rajapaksa as president and pledged accountability over civil war atrocities. Last year, Sirisena replaced the Prime Minister with Rajapaksa and dissolved Parliament. But the Supreme Court ruled against this and reinstated the former Prime Minister to end the political crisis. And in March, the UN approved another extension to set up a credible war crimes investigation. Well, we'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, Minel Fernandez reports from Kilinochchi, a northern town that was ravaged by the civil war and where people are trying to rebuild their lives.
See this narrow strip.
Yeah. Dr. Thangamuthu Satyamurthy has worked hard since the end of the war in 2009 to put the brutal conflict behind him. He's one of 5 doctors who treated civilians caught between government and Tamil tiger fighters.
Mother and father, they brought 2 children. So the one was had a head injury. I just noticed. I told them going to die. Then father brought the next one. The next child had an injury on neck, and I told the father this one also going to die. And they were crying, so at least help one.
Arrested by the government, questioned and released after the war, he quickly returned to his job. He now uses his spare time to teach young people how to make the best of their education. 10 years after the end of the war, Dr. Satyamurthy hopes programs like these will give students more opportunities to build a better future. It's an option that may have kept Kandalan from joining the Tigers when he was 16 years old. Today, his battle is to provide for his family after spending 3 years in prison.
I got conditional bail and have to go and sign in every month. This is a must no matter where I work. I also have to attend court hearings. The 3 years that I was in prison, we got into a lot of debt.
That's a common feature in most households here in the former war zone. Many families struggle to make ends meet.
These people who were devastated during the war, who could not earn a living for many, many years, even over the last 10 years, are still in an economic crisis of sorts. And we have yet to see how we are going to get them out of this.
High rates of unemployment have not helped. The aftermath of the war has left households struggling to cope financially with little or few opportunities. And many have lost family members or are waiting for news of those still missing. Government troops battled a 26-year war with the Tamil Tigers, who fought to win their rights against what they described as discrimination by Sri Lanka's Sinhalese majority. Successive governments could not defeat the Tigers until President Mahinda Rajapaksa took power. He won the war, but many say he lost the peace and alienated the Tamil people amid serious allegations of human rights violations. Both the government and the LTTE were accused of committing war crimes, but only the government has faced pressure to answer for its actions so far. A senior government official in the north says the government could have done more.
Every life counts. and every life need to be answered for, and without which we can't move forward our democracy. If we move forward without answering, our democracy will be a halo, and there won't be any justice for that. And I'm standing for that.
Dr. Satyamurthy hopes those pledges will be honoured. Till then, he's concentrating on helping young Tamils better their lives. Minna Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Kilinochchi, Northern Sri Lanka.
Let's bring in our guest now for today's Inside Story. In Dublin, Thamil Ananthavinayagan, lecturer in international law at Griffith College. Joining us on Skype from London, Charu Latahog, an associate fellow at Chatham House and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Sri Lankan Campaign for Peace and Justice. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. Charu, if I can start with you in London, 10 years since the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, has there been closure?
I think the most clear and decisive answer would be no. Closure not for the Tamil community, no healing and no real reparative process has been put in place. Not just in terms of judicial accountability, which is a far cry. I think in terms of really an outlet, receiving answers to their many questions, questions about the thousands of people, the thousands of Tamils who have been disappeared, questions about continuing militarization and military presence in the northeast, which is a very stark reminder to the Tamils of a brutal end to the conflict. So no, really, there has been no closure.
But President Sirisena insists the country is on path to reconciliation, Charu. What concretely has been done since 2009 to bring about reconciliation and unite communities?
Well, the measures that have been put into place, the Office of the Missing Persons,
Indeed.
and very fledgling attempts at transitional justice mechanisms have really not borne any fruit so far. The measures have been taken as a response to international pressure generated at the Human Rights Council, a resolution on Sri Lanka which called for these measures to be put in place and accountability to be some measures of accountability to be put in force. And so these responses, these small initiatives, were really a response to international pressure. But actually, in reality, not a single case has been brought to justice. Thousands and thousands of lives were lost. Thousands of civilians were killed. And indeed, it's egregious war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed by all sides, by all parties to the conflict. But none of this seems to have registered on the country's accountability map. So when we talk about reconciliation, another thing to consider is the recent Easter Sunday attacks.
Right.
And I think they would also bring to the surface the deep fault lines that sit on Sri Lankan society.
I think it's very important that you pointed out there that both sides in the civil war have been accused of committing crimes. It's not just the government at the end of the conflict, but also the Tamil Tigers. Let's bring in Thamil in Dublin. Thamil, you wrote recently in an article that Sri Lanka might be post-war, but not post-conflict. And certainly the events of the past few weeks, the Easter Sunday bombings, the religious tensions, the political climate have raised concerns about the future. But is another conflict really likely? I mean, many Sri Lankans that we spoke to, have been speaking to, say, never again.
Thanks very much for having me. Yes, indeed, as I wrote in a recent article, Sri Lanka is a country that is post-war, but certainly not post-conflict. And as you said, the recent developments in the country, especially in light of the anti-Muslim sentiments that are now emerging, I see a new conflict coming to the forefront. We have seen already these signs in 2014 and 2018 at the recent inter-religious riots that had happened in the country. And we also have to stress that Sri Lanka is, at the end of the day, still a country that is navigated since its post-colonial times within a prescriptive parameters of Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism. And we have to understand that any kind of an intervention on behalf of minorities in those countries is seen largely with suspicion, as I have also pointed out in my recent book that is dealing with the human rights engagement of Sri Lanka with the United Nations. So yes, to answer your question, there is a conflict looming, and we have to be highly vigilant to encounter the rising nationalist threat towards any minority in the country.
Well, let's take a closer look at Sri Lanka's population. It's largely divided into two ethnic groups, the Sinhalese Buddhist majority and the minority Tamils, who are mostly Hindu. Buddhists account for 70% and dominate the political and military establishments, while just over 12% of the population is Hindu. Muslims make up 9.7%, and Christians round out the number at nearly 7.4%. So, you know, when you talk about the current tensions, Thamil, are they religious tensions or ethnic tensions, or both?
Well, I think it's a mix of many things that has accumulated all over these years of post-colonial governance in the country. And different legislative measures have actually paved the way for a narrative that has fostered the attitude that Sri Lanka is the country of the Sinhalese Buddhists. Many scholars have written with many research indications that Sri Lanka is a country where the Sinhalese are living with a minority complex. They are the majority of the minority complex. And this kind of an attitude that was carried from pre-colonial times already, where certain leaders of nationalist religious movements like Dharmapala had infused elite Sinhalese politicians with this ideology, where Sri Lanka should be only governed by the Sinhalese, right, and minorities are just subjugated to them.
Charu, during the Civil War, Muslims were also targeted by the Tamil Tiger rebels and suffered at their hands. What has the government done to restore confidence among young Muslims following the recent attacks by some members of the majority Sinhalese Buddhist community? Has the government done anything to address the grievances of the minorities, whether it's the Muslims or the Tamils?
I mean, so far we've seen a sort of quite a strong reaction in terms of declaration of curfews and emergencies and the emergency regulations being applied. We've also seen that the narrative from the state is quite unambiguous about not tolerating violence, which is always a good thing. However, you know, the risk over here is that there are elements, very strong nationalist elements within the political system. And Sri Lanka does have a very strong history of tolerating attacks on minority communities. You know, what we saw on Easter Sunday came as a huge shock, but it is sort of, it has a relevance, and it has there was a resonance to what had happened in 2012, what had happened, you know, in 2014, you know, the continuous pockets of attacks that had happened against the Muslims were not addressed. And indeed, there was complete impunity and complete lack of state accountability in terms of investigating these attacks and holding the perpetrators to justice. So that sort of has bred an environment in which the minority can be attacked, and there is a feeling of deep insecurity within the minority community. I would like to make a very quick point about the Sinhalese state, the Sri Lankan state, which is a Buddhist state. You know, so when we say that it has operated as you know, majoritarian Buddhism and nationalism is in, you know, it has been the norm. This is entrenched in the constitution of the country. So, and it has been politically manipulated and utilized. And acts of terrorism or acts of violence only serve to perpetuate and strengthen the hands of nationalists.
We know you talked about the Easter Sunday bombings, and I want to come back to that. It caught a lot of people by surprise. Do you think there are some elements within Sri Lankan society right now who are wanting to take advantage of the current instability to perhaps create more trouble? And who would be those elements precisely?
Well, I think it's quite clear that any sort of destabilization of the government and the fact that there was a big intelligence failure in terms of picking up these information about these attacks. Intelligence wasn't shared between between the Prime Minister's office, for instance, had no clue. The fact that there is a history of complete political breakdown, very recent political breakdown, a constitutional breakdown in Sri Lanka last year, all bears to the fact that any instability will seek to strengthen those who support a more right-wing, hardcore nationalist sentiment. So there will be a political faction in the country which will stand to gain from this.
Thamil and Charu, I want to bring in our third guest now, who has just joined us from Colombo. Sudarshan Gunawardena is an advisor to the Sri Lankan Prime Minister and former director of the Information Department. Thank you so much for joining us. We have already started our conversation, and Charu and Thamil both think that Sri Lanka today is at a very precarious position, in a very precarious position at a crossroads, if you will, and that there could be more instability in the country because of what we've seen in recent months and recent weeks. What is your take, sir? Where is Sri Lanka today as a country since the end of the civil war in 2009?
Thank you for having me. After 10 years, actually, we have been trying to consolidate since last Human Rights Council sessions, where Sri Lanka government was actually given more time to perform and fulfill their obligations. Sri Lanka was looking good. And we have managed to start developing our own national institutions, especially the transitional justice institutions. We have established Office of the Missing Persons, also Office of Reparations. So we were actually looking quite good compared to the many other nations which came across situations like this. But as you know, on 21st of April, that something unexpected happened where suicide bombers do themselves in Sri Lanka. So we are in a bit of an uncertain situation. But I can tell you now, as of today, after 3 weeks of the situation, we managed to bring the situation under control. And we are trying to celebrate the Vesak festival, which is the most important day for the Buddhists in the country, from tomorrow and day after.
Okay, let's allow Thamil to respond to that. Thamil, Sudarshan says there that the government has been trying its best. The Office of Missing Persons has been set up as a state body to look into those who disappeared during the Civil War. Also, a law on reparations is being worked on. It's slow going, certainly, but it's working, is it not?
Well, thanks. When I heard the comment of Sudarshan, I had to smile a bit, because we are hearing the same narrative over the last 60, 70 years, that we need more time and that we have a special case in Sri Lanka, and that Sri Lanka also needs to establish its own indigenous institutions to address the concerns in the country. However, we need to understand that after the end of the war, there was the infamous special session in 2009 at the United Nations Human Rights Council that was rather applauding the Sri Lankan government for what has happened. And then moving on a certain evolution until 2015, and then immense pressure by the United Nations and the international community as such for Sri Lanka to create transitional justice mechanisms and helping them also to pave towards that goal. Yes, I acknowledge that we have an office for missing persons. I do acknowledge all of that. However, even after 2015, the movement towards a fully reconciliated country is not moving very much forward. Rather the contrary, in my eyes.
You mentioned the United Nations, Thamil. You mentioned the United Nations, Thamil, and it's true that after the war ended, there were quite a lot of efforts by the UN to bring about justice. But do you think the UN is as invested and as committed to bringing about justice today than it was in the early days after the war ended?
Well, I think after the retreat of the United States, which was a country that was very much pressing on accountability in the country, and given the fact that under the Obama administration, that was the predominant foreign policy in South Asia, and now under the Trump administration, we see a retreat of the United States from the international fora, but especially from the United Nations Human Rights Council as such. I see there is a lack of momentum. I see that the international community is not as committed as it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. However, in the last report of January 2018, the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations has stressed again that Sri Lanka must follow the path of transitional justice, and was very much concerned about the level of violence in the country, and was very poignant in that aspect to say that this kind of violence that we have seen against the Muslims, in particular in 2014 and 2018, it comes in a continuous cycle of 10 years.
Right.
And the reason is why.
Right. Well, let's ask Mr. Sudarshan in Colombo about that. Why this continuous violence? And, you know, with the new elections that are planned in November, a lot of people are wondering, you know, with the current power play between the president and prime minister, whether the political will is really there to bridge these differences and you know, to heal the wounds of the war.
This government actually came into power in 2015 with the promise of good governance and reconciliation. So the promise is still valid, and we have come a long way, especially by addressing the democracy deficit and also creating the independent constitutional institutions such as the Constitutional Council, and with that council is appointing the members to the independent commissions and so on and so forth. Now, yes, we are looking forward the next election, possibly in November, and we are having a cohabitation government.
Right.
So cohabitation governments, it's very natural to have tensions, and also it's the first time in our Sri Lankan history that two major parties come together. But I must tell you that at this point, at this national tragedy, both President and Prime Minister working closely now, and there is no difference of opinion about how to address this. And also both parties have made it very clear they are committed to address national reconciliation. So therefore, I don't see that the differences between parties and differences of opinions would not affect the agenda of national reconciliation. The clear indication was that even though there were many debates prior to the 2019 March Human Rights Council sessions, the government managed to send a unified delegation, and our foreign minister as the head of the delegation actually made comments and confirmed that Sri Lanka is willing to continue in this path of transitional justice and reconciliation.
Okay.
Therefore, I would like to assure that government has all intentions to address this issue, because we want to make sure that country will not get back to the past.
Charu, there's been talk about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Sri Lanka based on the South African model. Do you think that could work in Sri Lanka?
Well, certainly, I mean, it's a step in the right direction. It's moved very, very slowly at a snail's pace. But I think one important point to make is that the true reconciliation and healing of those who've lost and are in a state of trauma, really, over having suffered decades of conflict, true reconciliation will come by small steps. And small steps could mean stop the surveillance on the Tamil community, decrease the militarization in the north and east, ensure that people have an equitable and equal chance at employment and access to resources which is something which was the driver of the conflict for all these years. So, it is setting up institutions is all very well, but small steps which in the right direction need to be taken.
All right. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Sudarshan, Gunawardena, Thamil, Ananthavinayagan, and Charu Latahog. Thank you all for being on Inside Story, and thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thank you for watching. Bye for now.